What exactly is the role of meditation in spiritual life? How does meditation help you get enlightened? These questions have been debated for a long time by practitioners of Advaita Vedanta and by many others. Here's a story about my own guru, Swami Dayananda, that shows how the role and purpose of meditation is often misunderstood. In his 20s, the future Swami Dayananda was already so dedicated to Advaita Vedanta that he gave up his job to focus his entire life on it. He spent countless hours engaged in deep study of Vedantic texts and in important practices like breathing exercises, fasting, and meditation. But after nearly a decade of single-minded effort, his pursuit suddenly came to a complete stop, and his life was plunged into a state of crisis. What happened? Well, he had been told that his efforts would eventually lead to a profound experience during meditation. In particular, he expected to reach samadhi, a state of absorption in which he would directly experience the limitless supreme bliss of Atma, the true self, and become enlightened. But in spite of years of intense study and practice, that experience never came, and he failed to get enlightened. His failure led him to question the validity of everything he had learned so far. He was taught that to become enlightened, the conceptual knowledge he gained through Vedantic study had to be converted into direct personal realization, and that conversion takes place through the practice of meditation. In the white heat of meditation, he was told, realization of Atma finally takes place. He would later learn that those particular instructions were not at all consistent with the teachings found in traditional texts like those written by Shankara, who clearly explained the Upanishads and other Vedantic scriptures about 1,200 years ago. Contrary to those traditional texts, my guru was taught that gaining enlightenment is a matter of theory and practice. Vedanta provides a theoretical basis for the practice of meditation, and deep meditation leads to the state of samadhi, in which Atma is experienced as supreme bliss. After a while, he began to wonder if Atma, the true self, is to be experienced in meditation, then who is it that experiences Atma? Who experiences that supreme bliss? Who is the experiencer? He reasoned that anything you experience is separate and different from you, the experiencer. Like right now, while watching this video, you're different from everything you see on the screen. In the same way, while meditating, you're different from everything you experience in your mind. In fact, a metaphor sometimes used in Vedanta says, all your experiences are projected on the screen of your mind, so to speak, and you are the conscious observer of everything projected there. So, if you are the conscious observer of all the experiences that arise in your mind, then how can Atma, which is your true nature, be something you experience in meditation? Atma isn't an object you can observe in your mind, like other things. Based on this reasoning, my guru came to understand that certain parts of what he had been taught were somehow defective. Yet he couldn't dismiss the non-dual wisdom of the ancient rishis, the teachings on which the tradition of Advaita Vedanta is based. So he concluded that Vedanta itself was not defective, but instead something was missing. Some kind of key that could unlock the wisdom of the rishis and lead him to enlightenment. He spent many sleepless nights trying to discover that key, but after a long, frustrating search, he finally gave up. He surprised his friends by giving away all his books on Vedanta. His pursuit then took a very different direction. He began to study the works of great mystics like William Blake, Peter Ouspensky, and Lao Tzu. He also immersed himself in the teachings of Jiddu Krishnamurti and Pramana Maharshi. Then he happened to attend some classes given by a relatively unknown teacher in Andhra Pradesh named Swami Dayananda. In those classes, he heard the very same Vedantic teachings he had heard so many times before, but there was a crucial difference. Swami Dayananda criticized the presentation of Advaita Vedanta as a theoretical basis for the practice of meditation. He stressed the importance of a crucial but often unrecognized principle by saying that Vedanta is a pramana, an instrument of knowledge, an independent and self-sufficient means for gaining direct personal realization of the true self, Atma. This shift of orientation was the key that my guru needed to unlock the wisdom of the rishis and bring his agonizing struggle to an end. What exactly is a pramana? A pramana is a source of valid knowledge. It's an instrument you use to gain knowledge of something. For example, your 5 senses, sight, hearing, taste, smell, and touch, together form a pramana called sense perception. Sense perception is the instrument you use to gain knowledge of colors, shapes, sounds, smells, and so on. Another pramana you use is inference. When you see smoke rising from a mountainside, you infer the presence of fire there. So even though you can't see the flames directly, inference gives you knowledge of the fire, because you know wherever there's smoke, there's fire. In addition to sense perception and inference, there's a third pramana you use every day. When you read a book or browse the internet, you're using a pramana called verbal testimony. Verbal testimony is a philosophical term for a pramana in the form of words. Specifically, the words of authoritative sources. Those sources include knowledgeable teachers, factual books, scholarly articles, and sometimes educational videos like this one. Obviously, the validity of knowledge produced by verbal testimony depends entirely on how accurate the source happens to be. It's really unfortunate that we're inundated nowadays by so much misinformation in mass media, on the internet, and elsewhere. As a result, it's become quite difficult to judge the authenticity of everything we read and hear. So, we have to be extremely careful when using verbal testimony. Advaita Vedanta is so cautious that any verbal testimony, regardless of its source, is flatly rejected if it contradicts knowledge you've gained from other pramanas, like sense perception and inference. Shankara himself boldly declared that he would even reject sacred Vedic scriptures if they said that fire is cold. This topic about pramanas is vast. In Western philosophy, it forms an entire field of study called epistemology. Our discussion here barely scratches the surface, but it's enough for the matter at hand. Before we continue, it's important to note that simple experience is not accepted as a pramana, like sense perception, inference, and verbal testimony. All major schools of philosophy, both in India and in the West, reject mere experience as an instrument of valid knowledge. Why? Because experience only provides raw data, so to speak. It doesn't produce conclusive knowledge. Let me explain. In the evening, when you watch the sunset, the pramana of sense perception produces knowledge of the sun in the sky. But your experience of watching the sun go down doesn't produce any additional knowledge. That experience doesn't make you understand how the Earth rotates on its axis, or how the horizon is actually moving upwards towards the sun. Experience only produces raw data, and that data has to be correctly interpreted. But the problem is, we all interpret our experiences differently. One person might think the sun travels downwards, but another, trained in astrophysics, would think the horizon moves upwards. In the same way, anything you experience in meditation is also subject to interpretation. If you experience limitless supreme bliss, you're likely to interpret your experience based on your personal orientation and background. For example, a Buddhist meditator might think supreme bliss is a manifestation of the inherently luminous nature of the mind. A Christian meditator might think it's a state of ecstatic mystical union with Almighty God. A neuroscientist might think it's the effect of the chemical dopamine circulating in the brain and affecting its neurons. Since experience is subject to various interpretations, it can't be accepted as an independent instrument of knowledge. On the other hand, experiences can certainly help you gain knowledge when they're interpreted correctly. That is, when they're interpreted according to valid knowledge you've already gained from sense perception, inference, and verbal testimony. For instance, suppose you watch the sunset along with someone trained in astrophysics. When he explains how the sun's apparent motion is an optical illusion caused by the rotation of the Earth, his verbal testimony will give you knowledge. The same is true for your experiences in meditation. If you experience limitless supreme bliss, that experience itself won't produce knowledge of Atma, because it's just raw data. But if you interpret that experience with the help of Vedantic teachings, you can actually discover your true divine nature, Atma. How? When Swami Dayananda said that Advaita Vedanta is a pramana, not a theory, he was referring to Vedanta as a form of verbal testimony. According to Shankara and other traditional teachers, Advaita Vedanta is an instrument of knowledge that's capable of producing knowledge of Atma, leading you to discover your true inner self. But here we have to ask, how can verbal testimony, mere words, lead you to personally discover or realize Atma? To answer this important question, we first have to understand a crucial distinction between two kinds of knowledge, direct knowledge and indirect knowledge. Sense perception produces direct knowledge because of the direct contact between your senses and the objects you perceive. Inference, on the other hand, can only produce indirect knowledge. Your knowledge of fire on the mountain is indirect because you can't see the fire directly. But what about knowledge produced by verbal testimony? Is it direct or indirect? Well, that's a bit more complicated. Verbal testimony generally produces indirect knowledge, but there's an important exception that we'll see later. Here's a helpful example. On a visit to India long ago, I saw a beautiful waterfall at the foot of a little town named Gangotri, about 10,000 feet up in the Himalayas. Over that waterfall flows the Bhagirathi River, the uppermost tributary of the Ganges. Just now, my verbal testimony gave you indirect knowledge of that waterfall. Indirect because you haven't seen the waterfall yourself. To get direct knowledge, you have to go to Gangotri. So, if the verbal testimony of Vedanta can give you only indirect knowledge of Atma, then where should you go to get direct knowledge? Atma is already present here and now as your own true nature. So, going to a sacred temple or a cave in the Himalayas isn't going to help. More than that, to get direct knowledge of the waterfall, you have to see it with your own eyes. But Atma can't be seen, heard, tasted, smelled, or touched. So, how can you personally discover or realize your true nature? We have to inquire further. The ancient rishis discovered that Atma, your true nature, is Sat, Chit, Ananda, usually translated as existence, consciousness, and bliss. In this expression, the word Chit refers to your own awareness or consciousness, the consciousness by which you're aware of everything you experience, aware of what's happening all around you, and aware of what's happening in your mind, aware of your thoughts and emotions. Consciousness is fundamental to your nature because, in essence, you are an existent conscious being. That is, you are Sat Chit. We'll come to Ananda shortly. Since Atma is your own consciousness, that means Atma is actually present in your experience this very moment, present as awareness itself, as your awareness of whatever's happening right now. So you can't really say that Atma is completely unknown to you. You know that you're a conscious being, but you don't know the true nature of that consciousness. The ancient rishis discovered that consciousness, your consciousness, is unborn, uncreated, unchanging. Your consciousness is limitless, infinite, and utterly untouched by worldly suffering. Your consciousness is the divinity within you. All this is indicated by the word ananda that we skipped over before. So, even though you know that you're conscious, the limitless divine nature of your consciousness can remain unknown, completely hidden from you. For knowledge of your true nature, you need a pramana, an instrument of knowledge. According to traditional teachers, Advaita Vedanta, when properly taught, is that pramana. It can lead you to personally realize or discover your true nature. But there seems to be a huge problem here. If verbal testimony usually produces indirect knowledge, how can the teachings of Vedanta lead to personal realization, direct knowledge of Atma? Well, here's the exception I mentioned before. For something remote, like the waterfall in Gangotri, verbal testimony can only produce indirect knowledge. But for something that's not remote, verbal testimony can indeed produce direct knowledge. How? There's a great example in the famous epic Mahabharata that tells an amazing story about the mighty warrior Karna. Shortly after he was born, Karna was abandoned by his mother, Queen Kunti. He was raised by adoptive parents, and he never knew that he was really a prince. Decades later, Karna met Queen Kunti, who told him that she was his mother, and he was a prince. He gained this knowledge through Kunti's words, through her verbal testimony. But the knowledge he gained wasn't indirect, like knowledge of the waterfall in Gangotri. Kunti's words actually produced direct knowledge, leading Karna to personally discover his own royal status. Here, verbal testimony could produce direct knowledge because it was knowledge of something immediately present, Karna himself, not something remote like the waterfall. Certainly, Atma isn't remote. It's present here and now as your own true nature. So, just as Kunti's words enabled Karna to realize that he was a prince, so too, the words of Vedanta can enable you to realize your true nature as saccidananda, as eternal, limitless consciousness. In this way, Vedanta itself can lead you to personally discover or realize Atma. Also, consider the fact that Karna was already a prince. Kunti's words didn't need to transform him in any way. They only enabled him to discover his true royal status. In the same way, your true nature is already Sat, Chit, Ananda. So you don't need to be transformed in any way. You only need to realize Atma, your true nature. One last point here. Did Karna need to meditate on Kunti's words to realize that he was a prince? Not at all. Simply understanding her words was enough. The same is true for realizing your true nature. When Vedanta's teachings lead you to realize that your consciousness is eternal, limitless, and divine, then nothing more is required. Simply put, if the problem is not knowing the true nature of your own consciousness, then the solution is knowledge. Knowledge produced by a pramana, by the teachings of Advaita Vedanta. As we discussed before, the experiences you have in meditation can't produce knowledge on their own. But that certainly doesn't mean the practice of meditation is unnecessary. Why? You will never gain knowledge of Atma unless your mind is fully prepared and capable of making that discovery. To prepare your mind, certain spiritual practices are indispensable, including the practice of meditation. So, even though meditation alone can't make you enlightened, if you don't meditate, enlightenment will remain beyond your grasp. From Swami Dayananda, my guru learned that Vedanta is a pramana, an instrument of knowledge for discovering the true divine nature of consciousness. That fact turned out to be the key he needed to overcome his struggle and personally realize Atma. This key is found in many Sanskrit texts and commentaries of Shankara and later teachers of Advaita Vedanta. Then, why wasn't my guru told this in the first place? Why isn't this so-called key to realization more widely known and taught? Well, until fairly recently, the texts and commentaries containing this key have been taught mainly in secluded ashrams and other monastic institutions in India, where teachers and students are mostly sannyasis and brahmacharis, Hindu monks and celibate students. Orthodox teachers in those institutions used to think that Advaita Vedanta should never be taught in public. Why? According to them, only highly disciplined monks are capable of acquiring the full measure of mental preparation necessary for enlightenment. Their assumption is certainly debatable, but its result was to prevent Advaita Vedanta from being taught in public venues. In this way, the key to realization remained hidden away. But in the past 100 years or so, the teachings of Advaita Vedanta have begun to find their way out of secluded ashrams and into the mainstream of public life. Several important spiritual figures ignored the highly restrictive views of Orthodox teachers and chose to bring the wisdom of Vedanta to the masses. They began to teach in cities and towns throughout India and later around the world. In this way, the traditional manner in which Vedanta had been taught underwent a huge change. That transformation was crucial. Without it, so many sincere aspirants, including me, would have had no access at all to this body of sacred wisdom. Unfortunately, the transformation that brought Vedanta to the public also brought an unintended consequence. Here's the problem. For centuries, Advaita Vedanta had been taught from the original Sanskrit texts. To make those teachings accessible to the general public, they had to be translated into English and other languages. But when the original texts were replaced by translations, a tremendous wealth of traditional scholarship got lost in the process. Further, among later generations of teachers, many didn't know Sanskrit well enough to read the original texts. They had to rely on translations instead. But as we all know, translations vary widely in their accuracy. they also lack the clarity and precision of thought found in the originals. As a result of all this, the so-called key to realization, the recognition that Advaita Vedanta is a pramana, seemed to get lost. It disappeared entirely from public lectures and from books written in English. Yet, it never disappeared from traditional ashrams, like that of Swami Pranavananda, where the original Sanskrit texts and commentaries continued to be taught. Unfortunately, the popularized version of Vedanta taught in public was no longer tethered to those original texts. As a result, it underwent several alterations. A number of concepts that were completely foreign to the original teachings were somehow adopted. For example, instead of teaching that Atma is the consciousness already present in your experience, the popularized version of Vedanta taught that Atma has to be experienced in meditation as limitless supreme bliss. Instead of considering Vedanta to be a pramana that can produce direct knowledge of Atma, the popularized version of Vedanta presented itself as the theoretical basis for the practice of meditation. In the 1950s, my guru was taught this popularized version of Advaita Vedanta. Even though most of its teachings were consistent with the original texts, the so-called key to realization had been lost, leading to his long and difficult struggle. After receiving that key from Swami Pranavananda, my guru reread all the scriptures and texts he had studied before. But now he was able to understand them properly and used them as a pramana. Previously, he had studied Vedanta the same way you might study organic chemistry or world history. To study academic subjects like these, you have to learn all the main concepts and acquire a lot of important information. But Vedanta is completely different. To study Vedanta like an academic subject is like studying all the parts and features of a microscope. A microscope is a powerful instrument. It's a scientific tool that's meant to be used for research. To gain knowledge, you have to use the microscope. You have to look through the lens, not study all its parts and features. Similarly, Vedanta is a powerful instrument that's meant to be used. It's not meant to be studied like an academic subject. You have to look through the lens of Vedanta, so to speak, to discover what the ancient rishis discovered. You have to use its teachings properly as a pramana. All too often, Advaita Vedanta is taught and studied the same way as academic subjects, where the goal is to understand concepts and acquire information. But this approach strips it of its intended purpose. Swami Dayananda learned how to use Vedanta as a pramana. And over a span of 50 years, he taught many thousands of people all over the world. Students who attended one of his 3-year-long residential courses also learned to use Vedanta as a pramana. In this way, Swami Dayananda passed on to future generations of teachers the once lost key to realization.